Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland yet again, and in this video I'm explaining why the United States should not attack Iran. Look at what the USA is doing right now. The United States is already fighting in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan and Syria. Not huge numbers of troops in each country, but this conflict in Afghanistan, for instance, has dragged on for 17 years and shows no sign of abating. The United States has troops in South Korea, and they were on a war footing till recently, so they may yet be a conflict against North Korea. The United States is deeply concerned about the Yemeni civil war, and America's ally, Saudi Arabia, is engaged in combat there. The president of China has just said that nobody must divide China, that Taiwan is absolutely an integral part of China, and so on. So there are many threats to US policy around the world. And yet the Trump administration is saber-rattling over the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's astonishing how Trump is looking both ways on certain issues, like on North Korea. He's appeased them now, eager to meet their leader, despite having said there was no point in negotiating. And that's because Trump has got a weather-vane mind. He will turn 180 degrees on a particular issue, and he's just appointed John Bolton as his national security advisor. Bolton only 5 weeks ago published an article calling for preemptive nuclear strikes on North Korea. Think about that. Nuclear strikes that would kill millions of people. They've only ever twice been used in history, 1945 against Japan. So the United States is already in a very serious situation. It does not need another enemy. If the United States did drop nuclear bombs on North Korea, people would say that was genocide, that North Korea had not attacked the United States, had not fired a shot at the United States, no North Korean soldier had set foot on American soil, and so on. North Korea was simply developing nuclear weapons like many other countries have, and this is not a sufficient casus belli. And if the US was to launch a nuclear attack, or any attack on North Korea, then the North Korea would respond by attacking South Korea, possibly Japan and so on, maybe even Hawaii, as the North Koreans claim they have missiles with that range. So this would devastate South Korea as well. At the very least, tens of thousands of people would be killed. Quite a few South Koreans are US citizens as well. So the US has got its hands full. It can't cope with another war, I don't think. I think there's very little appetite for yet another conflict, particularly in the Middle East. It's astonishing to remember that Trump came to office vowing to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he's now casting around for the next target. So it's very troubling that John Bolton's a national security advisor. He has a pugnacious personality, to say the least. Trump is already combative and impetuous, and he's likely to make Trump even more impulsive. So Trump, as we know, is recalcitrant, reckless, a hothead, and he's desperate to prove that he's so tough, and that's by killing people, by starting conflicts unnecessarily. So Bolton is likely to simply strengthen those tendencies. Well, as for this idea of a war against Iran, the nub of it is Iran developing nuclear weapons? The Iranian government has vehemently denied this for well over a quarter of a century. The other thing is Israel, which kind of wags the dog in the United States, has been accusing Iran of doing this since the early 90s. And they will always say that, saying that Iran is on the cusp of developing nuclear weapons, that it's 5 minutes to midnight and so on. So Israel has cried wolf in this one time and time again. And obviously Tel Aviv is not trustworthy. The Israeli government lied about having nuclear weapons, saying that they wouldn't introduce them to the region. Shimon Peres was saying it in the 80s, despite Israel having already introduced them to the region, and even now won't tell the truth about possessing nuclear weapons. And so the Iranians may be developing nuclear arms, I don't know. They may have calculated that if they have nukes, the United States would not dare attack them, maybe even not Trump. So the United States has already torn up its deal with Iran. So if the USA is not bound by this deal, neither is Iran. And Iran will say, well, we are going to carry on enriching lots of uranium. The Iranian government maintains it's for civilian purposes, for energy. I just don't know. And the USA is going to impose sanctions on Iran. but these will be highly ineffectual because every country in the world, apart from the United States, will trade with Iran. But the USA has hardly traded with Iran since 1980 anyway, so it's going to make very little difference. So it's not going to dent the Iranian economy. When the United States liberated Iraq in 2003, Iraq had been enfeebled by 23 years of war and sanctions. Iran had a few years of limited sanctions, hasn't been at war since 1988. So it was much, much mightier than Iraq was in 2003. Iran is 3 times the size of Iraq in population and in territory, so it will be a much tougher nut to crack than Iraq. Iran is somewhat democratic. I know some candidates are banned from elections. I know elections aren't on an entirely fair basis, but they're not completely unfair either. It's not this maniacal cult of the personality, genocidal tyranny like Iraq was. The Iranian government has a lot of genuine support. So therefore, one couldn't rely on people rebelling against the government and helping the United States. So Tehran would have a largely loyal population. And as one of my friends from the region said, a lot of Iranians genuinely wouldn't mind dying if they're trying to repel the invader. Iran has cordial relations with Syria, with Russia, with many Central Asian countries. It sells a lot of oil to China, Pakistan. It has a friendly relationship with India as well. So Iran's got a lot of allies. I'm not saying they'll go to war on Iran's side, but the United States won't get any UN resolutions passed and will be condemned by almost the entire international community. So I don't think there's any public desire for war in the United States. I think Americans have had enough of this military adventurism, particularly in the Middle East. And it'd be hard to argue that the US is there to plant democracy, and the United States has a very amicable relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is much more dictatorial than Iran is. Iran's allowed women to drive and to vote for decades, things like that, has opposition parties, allows the Jewish community to worship openly. The Jewish community has a representative in their majlis, that's their parliament, and so on. So don't attack Iran. It wouldn't be legally or ethically justified. It wouldn't be easy for the United States either. They might be able to get to Tehran if they wanted a ground invasion, but to occupy it, to set up a government, I think that would be well nigh impossible. But just because it's such a moronic thing to do, I wouldn't exclude the possibility. There's still some slim chance that the United States might do it. It would drive oil prices higher, damage the US economy, and so on. And Trump is, I suppose, really a gangster, a wannabe, and he's openly talked about in Iraq, we should simply have taken the oil. He didn't say anything about paying about it, simply robbing the country. Because he always sees things as a zero-sum gain. We can't both gain by peace. We can't both gain by trade. Somebody has to be ripped off. Somebody has to lose, because that's the way he perceives the world. So we live in very worrying times with this utterly moronic, bellicose president who thinks that bloodthirstiness equals toughness. Real toughness would often be not fighting, of showing forbearance, of being brave enough to be called a coward simply because one avoids an unnecessary war.